Okay, we're gonna get started now. So just to introduce again really quick, my name is Janet Van Sloan. I work in the Natural Resources Division at the City of Minnetonka. When I started here 16 years ago in 2006, 17, we had a division of 4 people, and it was absolutely extraordinary to have 4 people in a natural resources division in a city, and now we have 9. So this city is devoted to natural resources. And we can't do it all, but we've got a lot of good people now. So this is Managing Woodlands Buckthorn and Beyond. And I say Buckthorn and Beyond because if you just want to kill buckthorn, that's not what we're about. We're about habitat restoration and knowing about the ecology and the systems that we're dealing with. And so a really good portion of this is going to deal with, you know, the history of the vegetation in Minnesota. I'm going to try and keep it moving pretty quick for you. But just to learn more about what used to be here, what's here now, and how we deal with it. And so it's pretty darn comprehensive. So if you have, because it's being filmed, you can hold your questions to the end and I'll stay as long as you want to answer questions. But most of what you have, I think, will be covered in the slideshow. Now, how did that happen? Here we go. Very good. So the first picture I want to show you is a picture of the Minnesota map. How many people have seen this map before? Anyone? It's called the Marshner map. There's a professor from the University of Minnesota who took land survey data and compiled it into this map. So at the time of European settlement, they had land surveys that went out to see how much timber was out there to be harvested. But rather than just look at the timber, they looked at the whole state, and they looked at herbaceous plants and shrubs and trees, and they surveyed a lot, got a lot of data, which was really great. So in Marshner in 1930, so the public land survey occurred. Here we go. Thank you for putting up with me, because I'm not used to this clicker, because there is a laser, there's a pointer on it, right? Thank you. Where's the pointer? Where's the pointer? Laser pointer. There it is. I found it. Okay. 1847 to 1907 was the public land survey. Okay. And then in 1930, Professor Marshner put them together and made this map. I'm sorry, these clicker buttons are very close together. So here we go. The real original map that he made is 7 feet tall, and it's in the forestry department at the University of Minnesota, and it's way more detailed than this. So this has been simplified. But you'll see there's 3 distinct regions here in Minnesota. We have 3 ecoregions. This one that has, it's got the yellow tones. That was all originally some sort of prairie. It could be wet prairie, it could be dry prairie, gravel prairie. Different types of prairie are in the yellow. Those areas have been, prairie roots grow really deep. I mean 3, 8, 10, 12 feet deep. And after the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, it's been 10,000 years of roots living and dying, living and dying, living and dying in the soil. So they basically, these are composted roots that made the deep, deep black soil in the whole central region of the United States, which is the bread bowl of the United States and part of the bread bowl of the world. And so this area of Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota and a lot of area below was converted almost completely to agricultural land and developed. We have less than 1/10 of 1% of the prairie left. So just FYI, we are in the central broadleaf region here, which is made up of green and brown. We're going to come back to that. And then we've got the northern conifer forest. It was originally the conifer forest, was made up of a lot of white pines and red pines, the big timber that was cut close to the turn of the century. The old photos that you saw of the giant logs coming down the rivers. It's been almost all cut over, and now it's second growth. That's a forestry term, second growth, which is more spruce and fir and paper birch and aspen. And you've still got some of those older remnants that weren't cut at the beginning, but that's the conifer forest region up here. So now we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit closer. We're going to come into Minnetonka. So this is the central hardwoods, which is a transition between the prairie and the conifer region. When it's extremely dry through history, the prairie would advance and some of the trees would die off. And when it was very, very moist, the forest would advance out toward the prairie and it would go back and forth. So here we are, and now we're going to zoom in. You've got a handout, and this is your handout. So this is 3 counties. We have Carver, Hennepin, and Scott County all here. And this is the vegetation at the time of the public land survey. And so you see we've got 2 different colors, 2 different color regimes here. We've got the brown tones over here and the green tones over here. And again, lots of different forest types within those areas, but the brown pretty much means, oh, here we go again, sorry about that. The brown means that it's an oak type of forest. And over in the green, it is a big woods type of forest, which would be sugar maple basswood, but there's lots of variations, lots of variations. The color coding is on the right. If we look, here is Lake Minnetonka. And we know that the city of Minnetonka only has Grays Bay Marina, right here, Grays Bay. Forgive me again, those buttons are so close together. So Grays Bay is right here, and that's the edge, the western border of the city of Minnetonka. City of Minnetonka is right in here. So you'll see that we're right on, we're mostly oak in Minnetonka, but we have a little bit of the big woods. And if you go out to Highway 101 and cross over into the fall time, you'll see really brilliant fall color. Those maple forests are much more prevalent just west of the city, but there's a little bit of intermixing. So now we look at right now. We have a map posted here that you may have had a chance to look at. You can look at it on your way out, posted on the wall. This is, of course, it's the metropolitan region, so of course it's built up, right? So we've got the Twin Cities, you know, the heart of Minneapolis. Here we are again, Lake Minnetonka. There is Grays Bay, and so this is the city of Minnetonka right in here. Now this is a little bit fictitious. I first should tell you about this map. The Department of Natural Resources decided they wanted to do their own land survey because it hadn't been done since 1930. Since Marshner, no, even prior to that, because Marshner in 1930 collected data from the late 1800s. So they surveyed the whole entire state of Minnesota. And this map that's up on the wall is from about 1990 or so. And this is what they found, these colored areas that were remnants of high quality native habitat. That's the Minnesota River down there. And there's some things missing in here because there's a lot of private land. And so it's not as depressing, quite as depressing as it looks right there. Here's the city of Minnetonka. Here is what it was at the time of settlement. And we've got, in 2005, the city hired an ecologist to survey the city of Minnetonka and find out where the remnant pieces of high quality habitat and forests were. And these are the areas that they found. You'll notice that here we are, it's Lone Lake Park. There's Purgatory Park. Here's Big Willow Park. Here's Jadana Park. Here's the Civic Center where we are right now. Out in the back to the north of us, there's a really beautiful, we call it the Horseshoe Woods because it's the same shape of a horseshoe. So we have a lot of our parks are still in here, but they were highly degraded in 1990, and the city decided they were going to undertake some habitat restoration. And so we were pretty early on compared to other cities as far as starting to do habitat restoration. So here we are. This is the only part that I'm going to talk about, the big woods, which is on the west. So once you go west of Grays Bay and Highway 101, this was the big woods forest that went from Monticello up by 94 down to Mankato in the south. Did stretch all the way over to the rivers, but this was the big woods, sugar maple basswood, and the green, the dark green, are the areas that are still remaining. Most of it was converted to agriculture and mixed development. And this is a publication put out by the Department of Natural Resources, showing people that, you know, this is what we had in the past, this is what we have now, but guess what? You can collect seeds, you can plant, and you can bring more habitat back. And that's what we're doing in the city of Minnetonka. That's what we're doing in Minnetonka. So, and I want to say to you, because I asked for a show of hands how many people had larger properties. Now I'm going to ask just the opposite. How many have like a quarter of an acre or less? Wow. The right people are here. There's just the right people. So if you have a piece of property that has woods on it and a house on it, there's a good chance that that woods was never graded with a bulldozer, right? Never got bulldozed. And that is the great news. So if it's full of buckthorn, but it's never been bulldozed, there are some remnant plant roots in there, and these soil horizons that were original, that were never scraped off. If it was scraped off by a bulldozer, then you just basically, you start to plant, and you have a planting design, which is what most people have to do. But you have a piece of woods that's never been bulldozed. So now I can show you some things that will help go through that process. So there are things that are surprises you have in the soil in your property, some things that are still there. So now when we're managing woodlands that have buckthorn in it, we're managing a whole lot more than just buckthorn. Every time we're out there taking out buckthorn, we're taking the non-native Asian group of honeysuckles that are also, they're the second most invasive. Buckthorn's the #1 most invasive woody plant in the understory of the forest. The second most invasive are the non-native Asian honeysuckles. As you move further south out of Minnesota into Iowa and Indiana and Illinois, the invasive honeysuckles become more prevalent than the buckthorn. So I think the buckthorn is a little bit more cooler climate adapted, but we take them both out when we are doing habitat restoration. So here we have one of the honeysuckles here. We're taking both those out. And then when you start to remove things, you're going to hear me say this over and over again, but you know, some of us don't remember very well unless we've heard things a few times, but when you take out buckthorn and you let more sunlight in, there are seeds in there, in your habitat, in your soil. There's a seed bank that is going to be just happy to flourish in that new sunlight. So we'll be talking about all those things that can be coming up afterwards. So the invasive species are always, always, always going to be there. So we can reduce them down to a very manageable level, and you will see some nice results, but we will always have invasive species to deal with because, of course, we're a global system of things being traded, right? So I made some assumptions, and I think I did a pretty good job, so I'm not going to keep it all. So I'm not going to leave this up. Well, maybe just a little bit. I'm assuming that the labor is probably you and some helpers, maybe your family. There will probably be some volunteers watching this presentation. It's oriented towards you and your property, but it can also be applied to parkland. And then if you've got a larger piece of property, like a few of you do, you might want to hire somebody, and now after this workshop, you'll be able to ask the contractors some important questions as to how they will go about doing habitat restoration if you want them to help you. All right, so here is what I was referring to. Each of you in the audience has your sample of buckthorn, and if buckthorn is open grown in the sun, as you see this one in the winter here, you get very distinctive opposite or sub-opposite branching. So in the springtime, in the winter, we have buds on the twigs. Here are two buds. They're not exactly opposite from one another. I didn't do anything. They're not exactly opposite from one another. They're just a little bit offset. So that's called sub-opposite. Can anybody look for that on your twigs, okay? Sub-opposite is what you mostly find with buckthorn. Here we see very strongly opposite. Here at the terminal end of this twig, there was a bud here and a bud here, and they grew out and formed twigs. but they were subopposite, right at the terminal. So when you have two buds at the terminal end of a twig, here it's a little bit small, two buds at the terminal end of the twig, and you can all find them on your samples, okay? Two buds at the end of the twig with a thorn in between. That's the buck and the thorn. It looks like so look at it here. Here we go. See, this looks like a hoof print of a buck. Can you see that? And a thorn coming out the end. That's where the buck and the thorn comes from. Now, those of you who have your buckthorn growing in the shady habitat, you're not going to see that on every single twig. So if you think, oh, God, I can't find that, just start looking around on that plant. All you have to do is see it one time. The two buds, they're brownish black with a thorn coming out. And it's usually going to be on a sunnier twig or a twig that's higher up on the plant. That is your positive identification. Don't go by bark. If you're hiring a contractor and they say they can identify it by the bark, be really, really skeptical, because our American plum and our black cherry and our choke cherry look extremely similar to buckthorn. And so you should be identifying by the buds in the wintertime. And then in the summertime, you don't have the buds, but you have the leaves, and you got a handout that show the leaves, and you can use that. And then there's the berries. So the berries, the flowers are right close to the twig when they bloom in the springtime. We have our native nanny berry that also has blackberries, but those berries will be at the terminal end, way out the top, in a cluster right at the top, and is drooping over at the terminal end of the branch. These are clustered close toward the twig. And you don't see the nanny berries too much at all anymore, so you're pretty. The females have the berries, and the males do not. And it takes them about 6 years to actually start producing fruit, so that's when you can tell the difference. And we'll talk more about the difference between the males and females as far as production, as far as removal is concerned. So the outline for this presentation, I'm going to read this really fast because you're going to get it all. We're going to talk about the range of management, and I'll explain that in a minute. I have some books and references that are really good and helpful if you want to learn more. Woodland structure, it's some forestry terms that are very easy. Native woodland shrubs that you can replace buckthorn with once you've taken it out. A lot about common errors during buckthorn removal, a lot. And then best techniques for the site, showing you some errors and how you can do it better. And so I'm so glad you're here, because you're going to save yourself a lot of time, because you're going to learn some kind of fun tips, I think. So within that, the best techniques are restoring the suppressed natives that are left, reducing erosion on the site, protecting the ground cover species, protection from deer and rodents. How many people have rodent evidence on your property from this winter? Oh my gosh, it's been a lot of rabbit damage this year. Woodland ground covers and wildflowers for replacing. I'll have a handout for that. Wood waste utilization, and then I'll sum it up with top priorities for good restoration. Here we go. All right, so I'm calling this, I'm like being like the college professor, and I have a degree in urban and community forestry, and so I have to show you the range, consider the range of management. So on two ends, two extremes, there's do nothing, which I believe is unacceptable, and then there's the understory clear cut, which I also think is unacceptable. So those are the two extremes on either end of the range of management. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do in here that I haven't shown you yet. But so a lot of times, so there are a lot of people that have forestry degrees and got good positions and threw up their hands and said, there's just too much of it, I can't do anything. And I don't think that's acceptable. There's always something that can be done. So usually the people that are over here are overwhelmed, they have a can't beat it attitude, they don't have a commitment, they have excuses about low budget and limited labor, but usually there's something that can be done. On the other end, folks get bit by the buckthorn bug, and they find out it's bad, and they want to wipe it out, and they will want a crease of yew shed, and they'll assume that now when you get really thick, when buckthorn's been there for 35, 40 years, it looks like there's nothing in the woods besides that. And that's an easy way to do an understory clear cut. Many times there are some remnants in there. And our parks are full of some of those remnants that were there. And it's very good evidence if you've been to any of those parks that I showed you, our larger parks where we have restoration. Almost all of that were remnant plants that were there that were allowed to regrow, or they were in the overstory. Okay, so the brushing, it's usually not an understanding where people just come in and they cut it, assuming that it's all buckthorn. They do brushing, and you lose the whole middle layer of the forest. And all the organisms that live in the forest need all that structure, the vertical structure. And so you're going to lose all of that. Many times there's an aesthetic interest to maybe increase the view going to the lake or whatever it might be. And many times you're setting your site up for erosion. We have a lot of slopes in Minnetonka. Raise your hand if you have a slope on your property that has buckthorn on it. Oh, I'm so glad. Perfect, perfect. We'll be talking about some ways to deal with some of that erosion. So here's the area in the middle, other options that exist besides these two extremes. And so we in Minnetonka are focusing on the practical measures with prioritized goals and their knowledge base. And that's what you're going to hear all about tonight. And you can go, the smaller your property is, the more detail you can give it, right? So there are a lot of folks who have done like they do at the Arboretum, where they've got a native sugar maple basswood forest, and they've got paths going through it with wildflowers, and they've also got gardens as well with non-native things. So it's something very viable, very viable. You can do this after a lot of time. You can do a full-scale ecological restoration, and the city of Minnetonka is now moving into that. When I first started here, we had 4 people in the Natural Resources Division, and we did cuts, and we did a little here and a little there, and we did the worst places. But now we have got a little bit more money, and we've got more staff, and we are moving into the full-scale ecological restoration in some areas. That's kind of cool. But on the homeowner level, this is where we're going to focus tonight, where we are going to have low or moderate budget and no prescribed burning, because most people can't do that on their small city lots. But that's where we are. So that's my range of management, and I think I've already explained all of that, so we don't even have to look at that. So we're going to focus on decreasing buckthorn and other invasive species besides buckthorn, decreasing erosion. We have these really heavy rainfalls, and then we have drought. And you can go out into one of our parks after one big, huge rainfall, and you can see a ½ inch of soil that has washed away from a tree trunk and exposed roots afterwards, if you pay close attention. We're going to work on increasing the woodland structure and habitat, increasing plant diversity, increasing benefits to birds, pollinators, and the whole entire food web. There's a lot of stuff out there, even though it seems like it's all buckthorn, right? So I'm going to talk about a couple of resources here that were good for me when I was in college and, had some really good information. Daniel Wovcha works for the DNR. He's one of the main authors of this book. And I believe he got his master's or his PhD by surveying Anoka County in great detail. So I have the public land survey here. The big first Minnesota map was the public land survey, and then we have the Minnesota Biological Survey, that's the map on the wall. And then we have a very detailed survey of Anoka County. Well, guess what? Anoka County is just right over the border. And so we can extrapolate almost everything from Anoka County to here in Hennepin County, with the exception that their soil is more sandy and ours is a little more loamy. So we can extrapolate. So in that book, when I first started giving these presentations, there are woodland fact sheets. So I told you about the different shades of brown in the oak region, right? So I got permission. We have the dry oak forest fact sheet in here. We have the mesic oak forest fact sheet. That means more moist soil. We have the oak, woodland, and brushland fact sheet. If you want to have handouts, that tell you what you would find in that forest type, all of those existed in Minnetonka. And we are right smack on the border of big woods, and so we've got things intermixing, and there are fact sheets here from this book that the sugar maple basswood forest and These are the most common, and you can come and get those later if you want. People who are listening to the taped version can come to the other Buckthorn Workshop. I have 3 Buckthorn Workshops a year, one in March, one in September, and one in October. Specifically timed so that you can go out next weekend. You can go out right after you, and you can do some work on buckthorn, because right now the snowpack is going down, and we can still be treating buckthorn and managing it before we have leaf out. And in the fall, it's getting less hot and humid and sticky and less buggy, and it's a much more pleasant time to work on buckthorn in September and October, which is why we have these workshops. So people who want to come, they're always going to be posted in the Minnetonka memo and online, these workshops. Okay, so here we are. There's the clicker right here. Now we are still looking at the St. Croix River Valley and Anoka Sandplain book. And here is an image, a graph from inside that book. Now remember, this is Anoka County. And Anoka County, before 1990, so here we are showing how much of the original pre-settlement vegetation is left in 1990. And this is the vegetation, native vegetation that was there before settlement. So you can see in Anoka County there was more savanna and woodland than any other type of forest. Does that make sense? Savanna woodlands. It's a mix. We're going to be restoring a lot of Minnetonka woodlands into savanna woodlands coming up. So here are true forests, how much is left, how much prairie area there was in Anoka County, marshes and meadows and swamps. But here's the thing that's like, oh my goodness, that's how much native habitat is left? Wow. Well, it means there's, if you like the food web, the songbirds and the wildlife and the pollinators and things like that, we have a little bit of work to do. And the cool thing is that you've got a chunk of property that can be done on. And that is the really wonderful thing that you have going for you. So here are the more surveys, right? So the Minnesota County Biological Survey, they have data and data and data and data. And they have, this is the DNR publication. These are 3 DNR publications, and they match those 3 ecological zones that I showed you on the first map of Minnesota, okay? It's not a book full of colored, beautiful pictures. It is lots and lots of tables of what species grow and what kind of habitat. You can go down to almost any place that you find in Minnesota, and you can find the forest type or the prairie type that it was and the species that were originally there. Just letting you know that if you want to go to that level of detail, these resources are out there, and the DNR has done a lot of work. That's the end of that. So now woodland structure. Remember we talked about that understory clear cut? We want to have the structure. Now, just like there are so many different types of forest and habitats in Minnesota, there's lots of different combinations of structure out there. So for example, in the sugar maple basswood forest, the canopy layer on top, so the canopy layer is the tree tops. The species of trees that have their canopy out in full sun, and they're the dominant ones. And those top 2 dominant species are the title of that type of forest. So it could be an oak aspen forest, for example, something like that. And then there's the shrub layer or the understory layer. It can be called either one because their understory might be a little bit better because there are shade-tolerant trees that can grow underneath the canopy of others. There are some species that are in the canopy that will not tolerate the shade of others. So understory is a really good term for it, but if you're doing an understory clear cut, you're wiping out that whole layer, and it should be shade-tolerant trees and shrubs and all these layers that the songbirds are using different layers, the animals, the squirrels, the owls, a whole host of organisms are using those different layers. Then we have the herbaceous ground cover layer, which is on the ground. And when they say herbaceous, means that it's like the garden plants that you have in your garden. There's nothing woody about them. They die down to the ground and they come back the next year. Now, when the woodland gets invaded with buckthorn, all of that kind of gets messed up. So I found the worst place that I could find, which wasn't far from my house, which was an aspen oak forest, and it was just a throng of buckthorn underneath. There were some native plants, but I found this really bad spot to show you that you can look at the ground and see the forest of the future. Do we see any wildflowers or sedges in there? No, we can't. What can we see? We've got missing structure in the buckthorn infested woods, and we can see it just by looking at the ground layer, by what's coming up for the future. Do we have any little oak seedlings in there? Do we have any little cherry seedlings in there? Do we have wildflowers in the herbaceous layer? So you can see that the future of this forest, this area right here, is pretty bad. We're not going to be having structure in the future. Now, here we are at a state park, and we have fantastic state parks in Minnesota. And you can visit just about any state park in Minnesota, and you're going to see some fantastic native habitat. Many of them were made into state parks because of the fantastic habitat that they have. And so you will see all different kinds of forest structure. That's where these books would come in handy to go to the different state parks. And it's just a whole succession of blooms and flowering times. You know, as the spring progresses, there'll be different layers of wildflowers that will bloom, and different shrubs that will bloom, and different trees that will bloom. And it's a wonderful place to look at woodland structure. This is Carly State Park, and the photo was from the conservation volunteer. So then when I was in college, I saw, well, I'm going to step back a minute and first show you that give credit to Applied Ecological Services. In the early 90s, the city of Minnetonka hired Applied Ecological Services to take a look at our parks and make recommendations to the city. Is it worth it for the city in the degraded woodlands that we have? Is it worth it to start working and investing on habitat restoration? So when they came through in 1990 and they did the public land they did the Minnesota Biological Survey, they weren't putting brown splotches in Minnetonka because the buckthorn understory was just thick. The other slide that I showed you in 2005 was when Minnetonka hired an ecologist, and they started to see some of the work that was being done and mapped them. Does that make sense? So we've made some progress. We've made some progress getting ourselves back on the map. But this was pretty shocking when I first saw this when I was in college. And it just really brings to light. Here we have the bar graphs again. This is right about the time of settlement. And we had that savanna type forest. So we had oaks, and some savanna is like widely spaced trees with a lot of prairie type herbaceous layer underneath. So if you were to see historical pictures of the Burwell House right down Minnetonka Boulevard, has anybody seen any of those historical pictures where it's much more wide open than it is now? There was fire suppression after settlement, and there used to be a lot more fire coming and going on the prairie, and that would keep the woody plants at bay, and it would foster more of the prairie type habitat. Since there was fire suppression, a lot more of the forest grew. So here we have, it's more of a prairie down below, and we're looking at species here of plant, 300 species of plant in this community, and about 25 species of birds. And then we move in, and the fire is suppressed, and the forest is getting bigger, and we've lost some species from human activity. And then we move, and the buckthorn invades. Now the buckthorn was brought in from Europe, and it started in the core center of the cities, and it was used as a hedge material. So it was, it makes in those nice formal shapes like they have in Europe. You can do topiary and sculpt them into shapes. When people quit sculpting them into shapes and let them get big, they got a lot more fruit, and then the fruit was spread around by the birds, and it's not a nourishing food for the birds at all. It's a starvation diet for the birds, but it actually did start to spread all throughout the state. So then we got here, and that's where we are in a lot of places, as you know. And the thing that just freaked me out is that I've actually got pictures. The next 3 photographs will show you these 3 stages here currently. But the thing that's kind of frightening, when I moved in my house in 1986, there were a lot of songbirds, and it was kind of a medium wooded neighborhood. We don't have, we're lucky if we get a catbird anymore. We used to have brown thrashers, we used to have rose-breasted grosbeaks, we used to have meadowlarks out in the country. There's a lot of stuff that has been declining, but we can make better habitat. So we're right now, 15 bird species. I don't have 15 bird species on my property. This is, somewhere. I can get 6 on a really good day, maybe, yeah, 6 on a really good day. And 35 species if you go to an outlot. So the city of Minnetonka has parks, and we're doing habitat restoration in our highest value parks with the highest value habitat. And then we have outlots, and most of the outlots are normally for stormwater drainage. So usually there's some sort of pond, right, in the outlots. Well, they are not maintained for vegetation. They are maintained for drainage, and that's it. There's not enough money to go around. But if you were to go onto a city outlot that is just maintained for drainage, there's no way you're going to find 35 species on an outlot. No way. So, just saying. So here we are. Now I'm just going to show you in real life. This is big willow after one of the very first cuts that they made when they came in with some big machinery, and this was in the 1990s. And they did take out a lot of understory. And so we're kind of missing that middle layer. But look at all the wildflowers that came back right away. And it had never been graded. So this is pretty cool. When I came on board, I was trying to save more of the cherries and the dogwoods and things in the middle layers and the ironwoods. And so now it's a little bit more wooded in a lot of these areas. But then, of course, the buckthorn keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. So now here, we're in my neighborhood in Bloomington, and I took that terrible picture on the ground showing you nothing coming up underneath. There happens to be, this is West 86th Street, and there is a bike trail. Well, that's a wooded edge. And so the wooded edge, everybody wants to get the sunlight, and so that's where you can actually see a few native plants once in a while out on this edge. But you see that layer of buckthorn, of course. It's an oak, aspen woods, but that whole middle layer is just clogged with buckthorn. So you've all seen that, especially in the fall. And here we are back in Minnetonka, and then we've got Dutch elm disease in Minnetonka. We've got oak wilt. We have emerald ash borer. And if we don't plan for the future, what we have left here is buckthorn and willow. This is behind Minnetonka High School. There's a few dogwoods right here in the front. But that's a little bit frightening. So we can do a better job and we can manage. And now you will soon. So here we are back to my neighborhood in Bloomington. And this is the top of the Bush Lake Hill. You know where the ski jump is on 494? This is the top of that hill. And in that woods, it is gorgeous. Oak trees, hickories, all kinds of wonderful plants. Very, very nice woodland plants. But here on the edge, it's solid buckthorn. It's just solid. And so when I was going to college, I didn't have a crew, no chainsaw, didn't have any ability to do any habitat restoration, but it just drove me crazy driving by all this buckthorn all the time while I was in college. I'll continue that story. Just hold on. But what's supposed to be where we have this just monoculture of buckthorn that's thriving, what's supposed to be there is a whole host of native species. We have 4 or 5 species of dogwood in Minnesota. We have 3 species of cherry. We have black cherry, choke cherry, pin cherry. We have American plum, nannyberry, a whole bunch of native wonderful species that belong in that understory layer. And every one of those has got a different bloom time. So in the springtime, when the pollinators are first coming out, the very first plants to bloom are the American plum and the elderberry. And when there's nothing else available at all, those are really high value plants. Now, American plum bark looks identical to buckthorn, and the twigs look almost identical to buckthorn. And they even have thorny twigs like buckthorn. And that is the baby that gets thrown out with the bathwater. So they were almost completely eliminated all over the Twin Cities, wherever anybody was doing buckthorn work, and they still are removed. And so I'm just hoping that you can pay a little closer attention to the buds so that that does not happen. But we've worked hard on restoring the understory over the last 15 years in Minnetonka, and we brought a lot of it back. So here is a wonderful book called Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy. He's an entomologist from out east. And this whole book is about the diversity that, it's just fantastic, the diversity that we need, and the invasive species and the monocultures. But the wonderful thing, there was just a big aha moment for me in this book, and that was, so I'm going to circle this for those who are watching it on video, Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. That's what we're talking about right now. In here is a table. What should I plant? Woody plants ranked by the ability to support Lepidoptera species. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So when I first started, I've been giving these buckthorn talks ever since we had slide carousels. And I always talked about the fruiting for the flower succession for the pollinators, and then the succession of fruit that follows all throughout the season. So we have early ripening fruit and middle summer ripening fruit and fall ripening fruit. And so there's all this food and this pollen. But I was not paying attention to the birds that are feeding their babies in the nests. So when the birds have babies in their nests, they don't want fruit. They want high protein for rapid growth and maturity of their babies before they fledge. And what are they looking for? Little caterpillars. And little caterpillars come from the butterflies and the moths. And there are just hundreds of species of native butterflies and moths. And here in this book, it talks about oak supports 517 species of moths and butterflies. And they lay their eggs, and the little caterpillars are eating on the leaves. And then the birds are up there flitting around, feeding the caterpillars to their babies. Well, we don't see it. It's all way up there. You might get one drops out on your car once in a while. But these are not plants. These are plants and insects that have co-evolved since the glaciers retreated. And so when they co-evolve together, the trees are making changes to have the insects not eat so much. So they might develop some tannins in the leaves so that they're less palatable. And then the insects are adapting so that they can eat some and then flit around to other things. Does that make sense? So they're co-evolving, making these adaptations where they can live together in harmony. And they're all getting something out of the deal. Now, when you take a species from a different continent that didn't co-evolve on this continent, and all of a sudden something doesn't eat it, nothing here eats it. Buckthorn falls into that category. Nothing eats the buckthorn, and so now it's got a distinct advantage over our native plants because it can outcompete them. Back to Douglas Tallamy's book, I'm just going to tell you the top 4 or 5 species that have between 500, 368 is the lowest number of these top 5 species, all the way up to 517 species of moths and butterflies that support the moths and the butterflies. It is oak, willow, plums and cherries, they're in the same genus, birch trees, poplar, which includes cottonwood and all the aspen trees. How about that? And we have these on our property. How great is that? A lot of people love to hate cottonwood. Our forester, Hannibal Hayes, calls it phytobigotry. And there are people that want to cut down their cottonwoods because of the cotton they produce. But guess what? And this is another thing I just learned a few years ago. Those that are studying the bees and the decline of the bees, the sap that's on, if you ever have I got a cottonwood in my yard, and if it's dropping buds during flowering, I get them stuck. And then I carry them around in my kitchen, and then I got little marks and stuff. That sap, the bees will line the insides of their hives, and it's antibacterial and antifungal. And there's colony collapse going on in the United States for bees. And so the cottonwood is really important, the cottonwood and the aspens. So anyway, lots of tidbits to make the buckthorn talk longer, isn't it? Aren't there? But those are some wake-up moments that I got from Douglas Tallamy's book, which is wonderful. All right, here we go. So now going back to the Anoka County Sand Plain book, and I told you we had these fact sheets for all these different forest types that are found in Minnetonka. I just went through them and found understory species from each one of them. And these are the most common shrubs in the understory in Minnetonka. And you can plant any of these you can plant on your property. You know, if it's something that was in the dry oak forest, you'd probably put it on the south side of your house, maybe, right? If it was in the maple basswood forest, you might want to put it on the north or the east side, or at the bottom of the slope, not in the driest place. That make sense? I have a handout that is optional for you at the end of this workshop, where we have a native plant nursery in Hastings, Minnesota, called Outback. And they decided years ago that they just wanted to have native plants. And they went through their whole entire catalog and found all the plants that would work in habitat restoration for you to replant in mostly the understory layer. Most of them are shrubs and understory trees, and I have symbols on them that talk about whether they need full sun or part sun, if they should have moist conditions, whether they sprout from their root system. So that's something you can pick up on your way out if you wish. Okay, so now we're moving into the nuts and bolts of the actual doing the buckthorn removal and the methods and things that have not gone so well with certain types of work. So this is the common errors I call during buckthorn removal. So we talked about brushing before, you know, the understory clear cut, where you're throwing the baby out with bathwater. Many times there's very little follow-up. You get that instant gratification, and then you're done, and there's a seed bank in here, and there's some good plants that are going to come back, and there's some nasty plants that are going to come as well. If it's on a slope, and you do an understory clear cut, you're going to have erosion. So it's okay if you do this level of cutting. If you're going to manage it for a prairie and have lots of follow-up, you know, seeding and burning and weeding and all of that, but that's intensive management that we talked about before. But if it's not intensive management, this isn't the best option here. So the next year, we've got that mix of weeds and native plants. But if there's something weedy and then somebody's not too knowledgeable about, and they're going to come out, you know, the city crew or something's going to come out and do some weed whacking or some spraying, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater at that time. And that's when you lose a lot of the wildflowers, because they're mixed in with the weeds. Okay, and some sites are really bad. It's like, whoo, baby, there was a seed bank in there, and burdock came back. Are you familiar with burdock? Almost everyone is familiar with burdock, because you get the balls stuck on you. And it's a biennial plant. The first year, it looks like rhubarb. There's no such thing as wild rhubarb. And then the second year, it gets a flowering stalk. And once it produces seed inside of those balls, the plant sends a hormonal message that it's finished its life cycle. So the whole thing is dead except for these seed balls. So if you've got these on your property, just collect the seed balls, put them in the trash, and you're done. But then you've also got seed on the ground. So you'll still keep seeing these until you exhaust that seed bank. Does that make sense? And that's the way it is with all of the weeds and the invasive species that you have. So when you start cutting your buckthorn, you're now going to be managing a lot of species, not just buckthorn. Okay, and so here we have a list of things that are very common to come in right away. Horiolisum, common mullein, thistles, garlic mustard. Are you aware if you have garlic mustard on your property? Can you see a show of hands? Almost everybody in Minnetonka has garlic mustard. And I'm going to show you a couple slides of garlic mustard, but I can't cover it much, but we have on May 4th, we're going to have a garlic mustard workshop, because there are some species that are so aggressive, they have loads of ways to survive despite your many attempts. And so, yeah. So we've got a lot of different things that come in, a whole host of them. Thank you for putting up with me. Alrighty. So here we have a trail, not far, it's called Prospect Trail, and it's not a habitat restoration area. But once in a while, we get a volunteer who wants to work on city property, and if you go through the process of getting some training, coming to this workshop, a number of things, we can give you approval to work on city land if you want to. I know that lots of folks here have a lot of buckthorn to deal with, and so I'm not. Anyway, if you're interested in volunteering, we have a program. I have a volunteer interest form that you can sign if you want, that you could take if you want to, but I understand you've got a lot of work to do. This gentleman was working on some buckthorn near his house, And so what we do is we'll go out and we'll meet with you. We'll put ribbon flags on the native plants, what not to cut, things like that. They come to the garlic mustard workshop, the Buckthorn Workshop, and can be out doing their own work. But once in a while, something happens and somebody else gets an assignment and comes out. And this is just an example where a crew didn't have anything to do for an afternoon, and they got sent out to cut buckthorn along the side of this trail. And it just shows that all of a sudden the baby got thrown out with the bathwater again. And when that happened, it just stimulated the garlic mustard that was in the herbaceous layer. And this is in November of the year when things got cut. And you know if they're, well, we haven't talked too much about garlic mustard yet, but that's coming. So you've got other things to deal with. So here's garlic mustard in a shady woodland. The snow is covered. This is a really big buckthorn right there. It's in Big Willow Park, but I can see in the wintertime, these are garlic mustard stalks from last year, and they all dropped seed. This is the seed pod up here on top, and they all sprinkled seeds. So if you get full sunlight in there, there's a lot of work to do the following year. The reason I'm showing you all this is that if you know you have garlic mustard, you might want to take your buckthorn out in stages and see how your woodland reacts to the extra sunlight, and then you work on different species at different times of the year. Does that make sense? Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so now I'm just going to have a couple slides. I used to have more. I reduced it about garlic mustard because we have it all over Minnetonka. The first year, it looks kind of like a mound of violets. It's low to the ground. It's called a rosette. So on the left side here, you see a rosette of leaves. And without going into too much detail, it's a biennial plant, and almost all of the biennials will have a rosette the first year, and then send up a flowering stalk the second year. And here's the flowering stalk. In the beginning of May, it will start flowering, and that's the perfect time to be out there pulling it by yourself. It comes out pretty easy when there's moist soil. Not going to go into too much detail. That's for the workshop in May. It's extremely invasive. It will take over the understory. It can eliminate a lot of wildflowers, but when you take it out, the wildflowers, many times there are wildflowers that are dormant, showing no leaves, but the roots are still there, and you take out the invasive species and they may come back. So that's good. But it's very nice that the garlic mustard is up and needs control between May 1st and the 4th of July. So it's got a 2-month window to take care of your garlic mustard. And guess what? That just happens to be the time where herbicide control does not work on buckthorn stumps. So it works out just perfectly. So that's a little digression here. So you've got the second year plant up here. It starts flowering, but then it continues to flower, and it will get taller and taller. So this is it's just opening up, but then it'll continue to elongate, and then the flowers will extend, and then at some point you've got little seed pods forming. And so when you get to the seed pod part, the seed pods definitely have to go in the trash. But we'll go through all of that in the garlic mustard workshop. So that's it's something else that we all have to be aware of. All right, so here we are back to the common errors, buckthorn removal, same site. There was some brushing that was done. Many times you talk to people about what they're getting rid of, and they'll talk about that's a low-value species that was taken out. What are those low-value species? You know, if you have a really clogged, okay, I need to see a show of hands now of how clogged is your property with buckthorn. Is it really thick? Show of hands? Okay. Oh, very good. So if it's not really thick, you probably are interspersed with native plants, right? Possibly. Now, it's up to you. You are the landowner, and you can decide what you want and you don't want on your property. But if you like something to be lower maintenance, it's a good idea not to do that clear cut right away and to see how things react. I already said that. So we have pioneer species. So when we talked about those layers of the forest, when there's a big disturbance, like fire or a giant windstorm, and all the trees go down and there's a lot of sunlight that comes in, that's a big disturbance. A buckthorn clear cut is a big disturbance. and then the forest reacts. And so the pioneer species are the ones that produce a lot of seed, and they come in quickly and they come in densely. So that's American elm, cottonwood, box elder, what else? I'm probably missing a few. But those come in quickly. Green ash, and they will populate the place quickly. Now, if you're fighting garlic mustard and other nasty species, you want to keep as many native plants as you can, unless you have that garden arboretum kind of situation that I showed you in the range of management. So, I mean, if you can have that level of detail to have anything go where any place you want it to be, go ahead and do that. But if you can't do it all at once, and you surely shouldn't have to if you have many acres, you can do it in different sections. It's good to keep a lot of those natives there until you get those invasive species under control. And if you want to have certain special plants that you want to plant and get the value right now for the pollinators and the songbirds, you pick your areas. I learned in landscape design class it's better to have them closer to your house because you're more likely to maintain them rather than way out, which I've learned myself, planting gardens way out. Anyway, so saving the native species is equally as important as removing the buckthorn in the early stages, and you just don't know how it's all going to react. That make sense? We are finally in the stage, it took 10 years, a lot of cutting buckthorn before we could start to cut out the pioneer species. So that's what we're starting to do now. When I told you we were moving into the big contractor level where we can gear up and do more fires and things like that, we're now finally starting to cut out some of those, the pioneer species. So some of the elms and some of the box elders and things like that. Okay, so now we have to talk about invasive versus aggressive. So I was telling you about a plant that comes from a different continent and it did not co-evolve with the species that are here. It has a distinct advantage over all of our native plants if nothing eats it. Doesn't mean that everything that comes from a different continent is bad. There's lots of things that have been imported that are just fine, but there's some of them that are really bad. So those are invasive species. They came from a different place and they're out competing our natives. Then there's the word aggressive, and I'm really a stickler about this. Invasive versus aggressive. Our pioneer species are aggressive. The elms, the box elders, and the cottonwoods, but they're native, and they have a place here, and they have a function. And so I'm really careful about using those two words that way, all right? So here we have, and I show this because this flip book, this is a DNR flip book, and I have a copy here, but you can get all of the plants that are in here. These are non-Minnesota invasive, non-native terrestrial plants. And there's a lot of them. But there's some players that are way worse than others. So for example, the garlic mustard, you definitely want to work on that. There's even worse stuff that hasn't hit Minnesota. It's going to make garlic mustard look like no problem at all. I mean, you can at least eat it. There's some really nasty stuff heading this way. But then there's daisies in there. Okay, I think daisies aren't a big deal. If you're a prairie purist, you have to get rid of daisies on your prairie. But there's a whole range of invasive species. And I'm usually talking about the bad players here, the bad players. Okay, so this whole flip book you can get online, but I have something even better. So I've been giving these talks for so long that things are evolving. There are a couple of botanists that were frustrated with how many textbooks you had to look through to find everything that you needed to find to identify plants. And they decided to create a website, and it's called minnesotawildflowers.info. And they started out with wildflowers, and then they went to trees and shrubs, and then aquatic plants, and then invasive species, and they just kept going and going and going. It's one of the best resources in the upper Midwest for finding plants. The one thing that I love so much is that there's plants out there that are lookalikes. For example, we have 15 species of aster in the fall, and you find one aster. There are phone apps now that you can use that get really close. But if you don't have a phone app, this minnesotawildflowers.info is just fantastic. I'm going to leave some cards up here for them, right there, for when you leave, if you want to. So I used to promote this book, this little booklet. You can get it online, but Minnesota Wildflowers is a lot better. But here we have the aggressive species that are not in these native, the Minnesota wildflowers will definitely tell you if it's native or not on the very first page. But here we have aggressive plants that are native. They're usually pioneer species. They come into a disturbed site. They compete with invasive species, and they're later affected by succession. And forest succession is just when the trees that are shade tolerant and can grow in the shade of other trees are starting to succeed. Now, you have your own property, and you can decide whatever you want to grow there, so we won't even be talking about succession anymore because you get to decide what that's going to be. So here I am back in college and get to the top of the Bush Lake Hill where the ski jump is, and there's buckthorn all over the place, and I don't have a chainsaw, and I don't have a crew, and I asked my city forester, could I do something about some of this buckthorn? I started to learn some skills. I didn't have that many, and they gave me permission, and this is where some buckthorn was girdled and killed. But what was in there were all native aggressive species. So if you wanted, people used to say, I'm going to let that section of my yard go wild. You can't do that anymore. When you let it go wild, there's a lot of nasty stuff in there, and some of them are prohibited noxious weeds. But if you let it go wild and take the nasty stuff out, there's some really aggressive species, and here we have, and so I already talked about green ash, elm, box elder, and cottonwood. There's sumac in here. That's an aggressive native. We have prickly ash. Most people don't like it because it draws blood. Raspberries and blackberries come in very quickly. We have 2 vines, which I'm going to talk about, and goldenrod. If you have prairie restoration, you're usually controlling goldenrod, but there's some very aggressive species that can fill up space. Just letting you know. Low maintenance. And then over time, you just decide what you want where. But in the meantime, it's occupying space that would otherwise be occupied by something way worse. Does that make sense? All right, here we go. So now we've got the 2 vines. So a lot of times people just like to get the vines out of every single tree. And we've got 2 native vines we've got more than 2, but these are the 2 most common. We have wild grape on the right, and they have done a study at the University of Minnesota that has shown that wild grape has become quite aggressive in its growth with the increase in carbon in our atmosphere. And so it actually can do some strangling. We only take it out in Minnetonka where it's on a high value tree or something that we planted like shrubs and then caged it, that kind of thing. We will take it out and we'll stump treat it. On the left, we have woodbine, which in the nursery trade is called Virginia creeper. It's a 5-part leaf palmately compound, and it gets fantastic fall color. That plant, well, we have 2. We're going to compare and contrast. The wild grape on the right, they have woody tendrils that can literally strangle a twig, and it will bust off at that point where it restricts. It's a woody tendril, okay? And then we have really delicate tendrils on the woodbine. Here's the cool thing. You can pull it down off the tree or off of your plant cage that you're trying to protect from deer, and you can put this woodbine that you see on the left, you can lay it down on the forest floor. You take some sticks and you put the sticks down on it to keep it with soil contact, and at every single leaf node, it could put some roots down and create a ground cover. So woodbine can climb in the trees. It likes more sunlight, but it can also be a ground cover. So when I'm doing restoration, I'm trying to get those down on the ground to compete with the garlic mustard. And here we are in Kinzel Park, where we have a fabulous volunteer who has taken every last speck of garlic mustard out of that park, out of the west half of that park. And what is left, this is about 10 years ago, was woodbine for a forest floor. How about that? I mean, that's not a bad deal if you're not wanting to go out and buy all these plants, okay? Now he really did a lot it's a lot better than this now. But just to show you that there's things out there that are probably on your property that you can use right away. All right. So here we are, back to the top of the Bush Lake Hill. I got permission from my city forester, and there was buckthorn, and I realized, oh my gosh, there's vines climbing up these, and you learn that there's habitat, right? okay, birds could hang out under those vines and have some habitat. And there was, in 2001, was the first ever Buckthorn Workshop in Minnesota. And I really got on the bandwagon and started giving presentations and doing stuff. And I learned about the frill method. This is not the easiest method. Just showing it to you because it's kind of a novelty thing, and then we're going to get into the easiest method next. But the frill method is where you use a hatchet or a butcher knife, and you go around the base of a larger buckthorn, a single stem, because there's some of them that are all clumped together and you can't get all the way around, okay? But I didn't have a chainsaw and I didn't have a crew. And so I got permission to do the frill method where you make these little flaps all the way around the outside. They're shallow, they don't go into the deep wood. And then you take a little sponge brush from the hardware store with the correct herbicide, which we're going to cover, and you daub herbicide in there, and it soaks in and it never leaves out, but it's still standing. And now it's got all these grapevines on top. One of them is grape is on the left and woodbine is on the right. And so now there's this cool little habitat in there, and they're getting more sunlight, so they're going to produce more fruit for the birds. And it was just a fun thing to do when I didn't have anything else, as far as restoration is concerned. So that was kind of cool. So I did that, and this is more of the frill method. This is a butcher knife that I use for my, and no, I'm not advocating Roundup. But the active ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate, and glyphosate, I know Roundup has just a terrible reputation, but let me tell you, I have to say this. Glyphosate is the least toxic herbicide that we have for stump treating. So if they were to ban this, and there's one city that has done that, you have to use more toxic chemicals, right? So it's water-based. We're not eating it. We're putting it on a sponge brush and a dauber. So here, this is the old method. This is when I was in college. There's the foam brush from the hardware store, and there is a bristle brush. And that went into a jar, and it got the herbicide, and then you put the herbicide inside the little frill flaps, and it didn't leaf out. I would put ribbon flagging on, and if it had polka dots on it, it meant that it was a female and it was producing fruit. So then it was a high priority removal because it wasn't going to produce any more fruit. So that's just an example, and I was messing around, but it worked. So here we come back the next year, and we've got all this dead material in here, and we've got vines climbing all over the place, but there's a section that leafed out. Remember I was telling you when you've got clumps of buckthorn, you can't get all the way around one stem. That's what happened there. All right. Okay. Now we get into the section of wait, that's not buckthorn. Okay? And every single crew that I've ever worked with has cut down some really good stuff. So on the left, we have black cherry, 4 inches in diameter. Okay? It was in a buckthorn brush pile, cut as buckthorn. Chokecherry gets cut down, American plum all the time because the bark and the twigs look like buckthorn. Hawthorn, pagoda dogwood, ironwood, which looks nothing like it. We've had crews take down black cherry because the bark looks so much like buckthorn. And if we just spend a little bit of time trying to identify, this broke my heart. This is a little story. When I was in college, somebody hired me to come to the city park to flag the native plants because I was giving my little buckthorn talks. And I put my little yellow ribbons around the native plants so they wouldn't cut them down, and I was putting them at waist level. And there was one chokecherry in that whole entire park, and it was this big in diameter. And chokecherries sprout from their root system, so they will form a thicket. If you take the buckthorn out, it'll form a nice big thicket. So I flagged it this high, came back the next week after they did the buckthorn, and it was gone. Because the person with the chainsaw is down here, cutting, and the ribbon was up here. And so I just would really get bummed. And so I was really putting a lot of yellow ribbons out here when I first started here. And my boss said, that's pretty, that doesn't look so good out there, but it definitely helped. We don't do that anymore. Not too much. All right. So the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. So here we have an example at Big Willow Park, buckthorn and black cherry, side by side. Now every different diameter has a slightly different texture. So I just don't go anywhere near trying to identify by the bark because they're just different textures at different diameters and different sunlights. So just use your buds and the leaves, please, please, please. How can you tell buckthorn if you don't have all those identification skills? Here is a really fun tip. In the fall, right about mid-October, all of our natives are turning fall color and buckthorn is green. You all know that. You've seen the buckthorn all over the place. But if you make a specific effort to really go through your woods, like every other day in the fall, and find these different colored plants, this is Stone Road on the south end of Meadow Park. It was wall-to-wall buckthorn, but it had gray dogwood in there and aspen trees and choke cherries, and we saved them. And we'd put spiral tubes around them, and the buckthorn would grow back up, but the spiral tubes and the yellow ribbons were still there, so then the next time we cut the buckthorn, you see some yellow ribbons down here. Anyway, it's just wait. Don't try to do something. So I'm old enough that we had the tie of yellow ribbons, so I used yellow for the native plants. I don't use blue at all anymore. Just find something. You can buy spray paint, white spray paint, and just spray a dot on the native plants if you want to. Because the buckthorn's going to keep coming back. You miss a stump, it's coming back, and it's going to grow fast because nothing's eating it, right? The native rabbits and the native deer are eating the native plants, and so if you're not protecting those, the buckthorn's just going to keep regrowing, and then you're going to have to find those plants the next time you do the cut, 3 or 4 years later. So here's just a few more examples of a buckthorn twig mixed up. We've got, here's white, that's gray dogwood, and there's buckthorn side by side in the same, growing in the same habitat. Just showing you that it can all look alike. And here we have, back to the top of the Bush Lake Hill, I did a frill method, and right here with the yellow ribbons is choke cherry. So now this plant does not leaf out next year. All that sunlight is coming in. This root system is dying, and they get more moisture and more sunlight, and they take off. That easy. How about that? I mean, it's just using what's there. And here we are behind Minnetonka High School, where the buckthorn was taken out. We got sumac on the left, we got American hazel, and gray dogwood. Took about 3 years for those to fill in. And where can you learn the plant ID? So I'm making all these assumptions. I told you that in October, it's a really good time to go out there and pay attention. That's why we have the Buckthorn Workshop in September and October, so people can be out there and doing that identification. When I was in college, this book was not printed, and we all had to just take note cards. But this is by Welby Smith, the state botanist at the DNR. This book is fabulous if you like plants. Everything that you want all in one spot, rather than having to buy 6 books. So it's about according to genus, so then you get the general introduction to the genus in here. All right, for those who are watching on video, we are talking about this book, Trees and Shrubs of Minnesota by Welby Smith. That's what we're talking about right now. And you will get the species, you will get the range map in Minnesota of where it's found. You'll get the range map in the United States. You'll get fruit, flowers, leaves, twigs, trunk, and the growth habit. I mean, this is just an amazing, amazing book. Okay? You can look at it on your way out if you wish. That one didn't exist when I was in college. We had to write note cards. All right. What else do we have for identification? We have Minnesota Wildflowers website. I already told you about that. Okay? It's MinnesotaWildflowers.info. It's a fantastic website. Of course, you can volunteer doing habitat restoration in our parks, and you can learn all the techniques that I'm talking about and learn bud ID if you come, but I understand that you have plenty of work to do on your own property. Just letting you know. We also have the Minnesota Native Plant Society, and wow, they're wonderful. They go on field trips, and people who are extremely knowledgeable. You can learn plants from people and go to really cool habitats by some really knowledgeable people. They also, I don't know if they still do, but they would have a plant swap. People like me that grow native plants on their property, and some of them will expand, and they trade and sell. Kind of fun. All right, back to common errors during buckthorn removal. It's almost impossible to get all the stumps. Right now is winter, and we have crews working all winter long. And you gotta be out there working, And if you're in the snow covers up the stumps, or else you've got really big, tall stumps. And in the fall, you've got leaves all over the place, and I tell you, they're just constantly covering the stumps. So this is a very common problem. But if you're hiring a contractor and they miss 80% of the stumps, wow, you just wasted a lot of money. So that to me is an error, an untreated stump. And if it goes for a number of years, when we have lots and lots of acres all across the city, we can't be going back and inspecting that exact spot all the time. But now we have more staff, and we can be doing that. But in the past, we couldn't. So there'd be 4 or 5 years of growth. You come back and go, wait a minute, we just cut that buckthorn 4 years ago, and it's already way over your head. And so then you got to hire somebody to do it again. So here is a brush blade. When you've got this small stuff, you have to cut and treat every single sprout, every single one. So here, the pruner is laying on top of the original stump, and 19 sprouts came up, and every single one of them had to be treated. Now, we hired contractors who use a brush blade. It's like a weed whacker with a blade on the bottom, and they'll zing them all down. And anyway, it just is a job that needs to be done again and paid again, and it's expensive. But if you do it right the first time, now I'm getting to the cut stump treatment. I'm leading into it. So here is north of Minnehaha Creek here at Civic Center. So if you take our trails to the bridge that goes across the creek, this is right across the creek at Civic Center. And he was big buckthorn. And I thought to myself, you know, what if we were just to leave a tall stump? Because you've got brush all over the place. It's just a tangle of brush. And when you're dragging brush out, all the stumps are getting covered up. And so we left some stumps tall, because then you can come back when the brush is out or you've done whatever you want to do with the brush. And the stump is a reminder. Something still has to be done here. We need to do one final cut. You need to have a fresh cut and then treat it. So that became a new method that we started using in Minnetonka. And now this is an old slide from when I first started working here in the Buckthorn Blaster Dauber. This is at Burwell House, and we're still using the jar. I'm not interested in breathing any of the spray because I've already had cancer, and I'm not interested in any of that. So I always use a paintbrush or a dauber so that you're not breathing the vapors. And a lot of times you'll see people who treat the whole entire stump. We are now finally talking about the easiest way to control buckthorn. And we've been in here how long? A long time. So thank you for waiting. This is the cut stump treatment. It's the easiest way to control buckthorn, the cut stump treatment. So here's older buckthorn. Raise your hand, please, if you have older buckthorn on your property. Older? Okay. This is what's going to work. This will work right here. And so now we have new methods, and I'm going to show you some of the newer products. This is the older product. This is back from 2006. And there's no blue dye in here. We use blue dye. This is glyphosate, water-based, 18 to 20. Oh, take a picture of the next one, not this one, okay? Next one. This is the old method, okay? But the cambium is where you want to do the treatment, the cambium. The cambium is just underneath the bark. So it's going to grow bark to the outside. It's an apical, it's a meristem. It's a growth point. It grows bark to the outside, and it grows wood to the inside. And the phloem will take the herbicide down into the root system. And it's just a couple cell layers thick, and it's right underneath the bark. And this is where you plant. See everything that looks yellow here? That is the herbicide that does not have the color dye in it. And that's all you need to do. Just go around it a few times to make sure that it's soaking in. It's not going to leaf out. Done. Done. You got to do it at the right time. So there's a couple of really specific details that you can do something wrong and people say, no, that doesn't work. Well, okay, your stump was too tall. You didn't treat it at the right time of the year. You didn't have the right concentration. That's all in your yellow handout. Do you have the yellow handout? Chemical control of buckthorn. On the back side, you will see the glyphosate. Can you find the glyphosate on there? The glyphosate has to be the, it might be a yellow white handout with a, I'm going to get it for you. Okay. It's the, there, okay, so we ran out of the first ones? Okay. Would you be willing to hand those out for me?
I think everybody should have one.
Oh, they should.
Natural resource.
Okay, if it says it has yellow highlight on the top, chemical control, okay, there you've got it. So glyphosate, you have to, when you're reading the herbicide bottle, I'm going to get a different slide on here. We're going to just stop. This is the one to take the picture of, if you want to take a picture, okay? Because now we don't have to deal with the sponge brushes anymore. There's the Buckthorn Blaster, invented by a woman in Minnetonka. She had her own little, she said somebody should take one of those bingo daubers and put herbicide in it. These are bingo daubers that are ordered, and you put the herbicide in. It's fantastic. I'm not supposed to, what should I say, endorse any product. And I'm not making any money, but I'll tell you, it made my life wonderful. So this is a Buckthorn Blaster dauber. And for those who are watching, you can see it's the white tube there. It's upside down. You can take the cap off. You can put it in your pocket. You're not going to lose it, okay? You're daubing. It's not leaking or dripping anywhere. You don't have a spray nozzle or a backpack or a tank. And there's a little spring in there. And as you daub it up and down, not scrape it across the stump, daub it up and down, this will last for a very long time. And you just go around about 4 or 5 times, right at the very outside under the cambium, and let it soak in. We've got the blue dye in there so you know what stumps you've treated and which ones you haven't. This holds a half a cup of herbicide. Now, on that handout that you have, when you're buying herbicide product, this does not come with the herbicide in it, but you can go to the website. I've got a handout for when you leave that tells you the website where you can buy these guys. But when you're buying herbicide, glyphosate is readily available at the big box stores like Home Depot and Menards, but you got to look in the bottom corner of the herbicide and it'll say active ingredient. Now they've got lots of different active ingredient concentrations because if you're going to squirt weeds in your driveway, you only need 3%. For the stump treatment, you need 18 to 20%. Sometimes it's sold at 41%. Then you just add water, okay? Add half water and half chemical to make the 20%. Does that make sense? It's in the Buckthorn chemical handout. There's 2 versions floating around. They're both written a little bit different order. But, so this is a wonderful, wonderful tool. Now, glyphosate is the least toxic, but you can't use it in the winter below freezing because it's water-based and it won't absorb. So that's another reason where you would leave that tall stump. So I showed you that other picture. In the winter when there's snow, it's a lot easier to be dealing with your brush and cutting and stacking or cutting it up or putting it through the chipper or leave it in windrows on the side of the hillside, which I'm going to show you soon. Dealing with your brush all at one time. You do have a tripping hazard if you're leaving taller stumps. So I mean, you can knock yourself in the shin, you can trip. But the nice thing about separating the 2 activities is that you don't have to now have 2 different kinds of herbicide in your garage that aren't going to get used for, you don't need very much of this stuff at all. And if you bought one for the winter and one for the summer or for other times, you're adding a lot of extra waste. Anyway, so I'm just going to keep moving on. More things are going to come up. So here we are. 15 years ago, this was what not to do because the city in Bloomington came and cut the buckthorn when there was snow on the ground, and they didn't treat the stump. Well, yes, that was wrong that they didn't treat the stump, but it was high. The stumps are high. Notice how when it resprouted, all the sprouts are coming off the upper stump. You don't have 16 cuts to make down here. Does that make sense? That's another advantage of leaving the tall stump. If you can't get treated right away and it's going to leaf out the whole summer, you can still treat it in the fall. If you went on vacation, your spring break vacation, you came back, everything's leafing out and you can't be treating stumps. So I have to tell you right now, this is really important. With the water-based glyphosate, with all of these herbicides, You can't be treating in May and June and a portion of July, because when the plant is growing, it's pushing up its liquids and it's growing and pushing up and out, and it's not taking things down into the root system. Does that make sense? So there's that period of time. That's another one where people will say, oh, that doesn't work. Well, you might have treated it at the wrong time. You could get some little distorted leaves and stuff, but they will grow out. They will continue to grow. They won't be killed. I'm just saying, if you leave that taller stump, you can come back and do that later. You just don't want to leave it too long, which I've been guilty of doing. So, tall, untreated stuff. When and why? What are the benefits? When? When it's frozen, or when there's too much snow on the ground? Or when you've got a bunch of people and you're going to be dragging leaves and brush all over the place. You come back and you make a fresh cut, 1 inch off the ground, and treat it, and you're done. Does that make sense? That's a really important piece. If you miss that piece, it's got to be fresh cut. All right, here we go. So now back to when I was in college, and I'm using my polka dot. You know, this is a female. It's full of fruit. Top priority. So if you've got a big piece of property, and you can't do it all once, it's not good to just do from one end and then to the other. It's better to find out which ones are fruiting and get rid of the females. So if you can identify them somehow, by middle of winter, most of those berries are falling off. And it takes 6 years for a buckthorn to produce its first berries. So if it's a missed stump, it might take 3 or 4 years and it starts to produce berries again. If you just see one berry that's close to the stem, you know it's female, and you got to get on it. It doesn't have to be all globbed full like this. But that's a high priority. So rather than doing a clear-cut, understory clear-cut on your whole entire property, just go through and find out where the females are. Those are very high priority. And equally as high priority are to flag the native plants. Somehow, when they're turning fall color, when you do bud ID, and not to cut those, and to somehow protect them, because the rabbits and the deer want the native plants, right? And so those are the top 2 priorities. So you don't have to be overwhelmed about this whole big property that's got all this buckthorn on it. You do those 2, and you keep working on those 2, and then when you hit May, and the garlic mustard is blooming, you stop all the buckthorn work, and then you focus on the garlic mustard for exactly 2 months. Okay. It's complicated, but it works. So here we are. So we got some volunteers, and we cut down. See this? There's a little red twig in here on this left picture. Can you see that? That's wild rose. And so all that buckthorn stuff. And sometimes I literally would have to be there. If somebody was cutting, I'd be holding onto the wild rose and say, okay, don't cut this. Don't cut this. It's like crazy. And then, look at this. This is the slope where all the buckthorn was. This is a couple years later. And it was a disturbance, so it took off and got more sunlight, and it put up these new canes. These are wild roses. And then the bonus was in the fall when the woodland sunflower was never there before, but the roots were there under the buckthorn, and the woodland sunflower came up. That's a really good story. It's not always going to happen, because some woods have been so infested for so long, who knows how long those roots will last. I don't know, but it was on the edge where I showed you the trail. Anyway, some good stories, There's also a lot of native plant producers that produce all these good plants as well. So now we have some more best techniques for the site, the erosion prevention and using that wood that you have. So if you are willing to do a little extra labor, you'll see that this was an old picture because I didn't have, it's back when I was in college and I didn't have the dye in there, but that stump is treated. If you were to delimb that buckthorn log and put it on the uphill side of the stump on a slope, it's not going to roll down, but guess what? It's going to slow down the water flow when we have those heavy rains. It's going to trap some leaf litter, and it's going to slow the soil washing. So here, see if I missed anything here in this list. The log on the uphill side of the stump, it slows the water flow, it increases the water infiltration because the water's going slower, it traps the leaves, reduces the soil temperature, and retains more moisture because there's a cover. And there's habitat for low end of the food web. So I mean, you've got tree frogs, and you've got You've got rodents that hopefully the raptors are eating, but there's the food web living in there. So now we got a lot of pictures here. Now this is kind of messy. We had a volunteer event at Lake Rose. We've got a fantastic group of volunteers at Lake Rose Park. So it is not messy anymore. But we had a one-day event, and it's just incredibly steep slope going down to the lake. And we left logs on the slope. And you come back later, and you see all of this erosion down below the logs and leaves trapped above the logs. It's just what nature does. You just make sure it goes perpendicular to the downhill slope, right? This is what nature does. There's nature. There's a log laying across the slope. It's eroding down here. It's trapped soil up there. Makes sense. So here's, we had a contractor in there, and they just started putting some of the buckthorn brush alongside the deer trail because people are using the deer trail for a footpath. So then here's some much more messy stuff. You know, when the volunteers are gone, you leave, and then it's going to stay that way for a while. But this volunteer group that's work at Lake Rose is just absolutely pristine now if you go out there. But it's just an example of wood waste utilization, and it has some benefit. And now we move on to the weed wrench. Anybody heard of a weed wrench where you wrench them out? It is an incredibly satisfying tool to use. Very satisfying. Here we have a clamp. And you put the clamp around the trunk of the tree, and this is the lever, and you pull the lever over, and you wedge the root out of the ground. It's really satisfying, but it's a lot of work. So I just told you the best way that cut stump treatment. It's the easiest, the least work, and you're done. Here you pull a big root system out, and I'm bummed that we shook all of the soil off of that root ball before taking the picture. Usually there are these other longer roots, and it's just globs with black dirt, nice black dirt. And it's got to be completely shaken off into that hole. If you're on a slope, you just loosened all that soil for the next rainfall to wash the soil down the hill. So you've got to shake it like crazy. You've got to put the soil back in place. You've got to replace the leaf litter because there's weed seeds in the soil. And then you've got to dispose of that stump as opposed to cutting and stump treating. So we have the weed wrench for free loan, and I try and discourage people to come to the Buckthorn Workshop and learn how to do it better. But we have it. But anyway, I don't recommend it on slopes at all. At all. So I have one in my garage, and it never gets used. Oh, I have to tell you one more story. This is when I was in college, too. There was a Buckthorn event in November up in Maple Grove put by the city forester, and we were going to be using the weed wrenches. It was after the leaves had fallen, and when some of the buckthorn was still green, so we knew that we were getting the buckthorn out only. Wrenching them out, it was the last time I ever used it because we're wrenching it out, and up with the root ball came sedges and wildflower roots, and they were all going into the cull pile. So we had wildflowers and sedges from that original forest floor of the big woods forest in Maple Grove, and they were all in this pile. And I was just like trying to pull them out and put them back in the ground, and I thought, forget it, that's the end of that. So if you want to hire a contractor and you have a larger piece of property, and they want to bring in a bobcat, you think about the wildflowers and the sedges that are in that soil. And people like to rip out stumps. I'll rip those stumps out for you. I got a bobcat. You know, when you rip out the stump, you're doing a lot of soil disturbance, and things are coming up with it. So for the city of Minnetonka, if we're having machinery in the woods, it has to be frozen ground, pretty much, or on a trail. And if they're removing a diseased tree, it's a contractor, and a tree has to come out, and they make ruts, they have to fill them up with wood chips before they leave, hopefully. That's the rule. So what I'm getting at is that we're back to that forest structure in the layers, and recreating habitat in all those layers and diversity in all those layers for the songbirds, for the pollinators, for the diversity, all of that. Okay? So I don't recommend the reed wrench, but it's a fun tool to use. All right. And then there's hand pulling, which is it's like the weed wrench, only it's a smaller size, usually 1/2 inch or less. Works really good when the soil is moist. They come out very well. Huge glob of soil. You got to shake all soil, put it all back into right back into that hole and replace the leaf litter and kind of tamp it down so that it doesn't go washing down the hill. And then it's so funny. Always when we get Boy Scouts, it's really funny. They'll always whack the soil ball against the tree. Why would you not want to do that? If a garlic mustard plant comes up and sprinkles seeds down on that bare exposed soil, you have a brand new garlic mustard patch. And so you want that soil to go back into its hole and get placed where it is. And so it's fun to get your soil off that way, but that's something. So here's the wildflowers. They're supposed to be there, and a lot of these will come back when you start removing your buckthorn. And so Pennsylvania sedge, there are just a few sprigs on my property, and remove some other stuff, and it starts to spread by underground rhizomes. Very nice. That's in the lower right corner is the Pennsylvania sedge. And we have rue anemone. It's still in our parks. The wild violets, thank goodness we have wild violets. They're going to last forever. Here we have Jack in the Pulpit. Jack in the Pulpit is one of the least favored by wildlife, so it's almost always comes back when you take the buckthorn out. There are these dormant bulbs that sit in the ground for decades, and then you take the buckthorn out and you've got Jack in the Pulpit. And then when there's I'll show you that later. I'll come back next. All right, here we are. So more about results after the buckthorn cut. We got gazillions of seedlings. Wow, so you're not going to be cutting and stump treating all of those, right? So now you can do the foliar spray, which is a lower percent of concentration, and then you have to do the tank thing if you want to spray. But here we have, this is interesting. Do you see this right in the middle? Something grew 3 feet after the buckthorn got cut. Is there anybody that can tell me what that might be that grew 3 feet? Right here. Plant right there. So it's not a seedling, because the seedlings only grow about this much the first year. Oh, shoot. These buttons are so close together. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, that is the sprout from an aspen tree. Aspen trees sprout from their root system, and they form a clone. So we know when you're driving up north in the fall, and that whole entire grove of aspen trees turns the exact same color of yellow, it's because they're all interconnected by the same root system. So you take out buckthorn, it's a disturbance, it stimulates a response, there's more warmth coming to the ground, and the aspen roots will sprout up. And that's a perfect place to slap a cage around it, because the deer definitely want to eat that, for sure. But we also have the issue of all these seedlings. So you can hand pull. What I would do is hand pull around the plants that you want to keep, so you're not going to get any spray next to this plant that you want to keep. Put a cage around it, a spiral tube for the rodents, and then you can spray the stuff that's further away so it doesn't harm. There's also a timing. The timing is very important. The natives are turning fall color in middle of October. So when the natives are turning fall color and starting to go dormant and the buckthorn is still green, that's the time to spray. It's a very narrow window of time in the fall, and that's a really good time to do it. Let's see here, 5% glyphosate when the seedlings are 1 to 2 feet tall. I don't like to spray any taller than that, because then you're getting way too many vapors and you're getting drift and you're exposing yourself. Okay, now here are some things that come back, that fairly readily come back. But you got to protect them because the deer. This is fall Solomon seal, and it's got red berries in the fall. And you can collect these berries, just squish the pulp off and stick the seed in the ground. The pulp is a germination inhibitor. And so I'll take the plant cages that I put around the plants that I want to save, and I'll put them inside the cages so I have a wildflower layer underneath my woody plant. Here is a clump of shiny, shiny red berries. Who's ever seen these in their woods before? Anybody? What? They're so close, these little things are so close to each other. All right. This is a cluster of Jack in the Pulpit berries. They're poison. They will swell up your throat. You don't want to take them, but there's about 3 white seeds inside. You squish the pulp off and just stick them in the ground. The first year when they germinate, it's going to be the size of a quarter, a single little leaf. And then the next year, it's going to be a little leaf of 3. And it's going to be about this tall. And if it's got enough sunlight, it could have a tiny little Jack in the Pulpit the 3rd year. And each year that bulb is getting bigger, and it can get bigger and bigger and bigger until it can be tropical. There are some that literally are this tall in some of our parks, which is pretty fun. So I suggest that, if you have a woodland that's never been bulldozed, you can wait and see what's coming up. Now, if you've got garlic mustard, you're going to have a solid ground cover of garlic mustard, but you can have some other things in there too. Some things that aren't so showy, and that's where Minnesota Wildflowers comes in, or you can bring samples in to me, not on a Friday, but maybe pressed in some paper and put them at the desk, and I can call you and try and help you identify some things if you want. But it's nice to have a few years go by where you're cutting some buckthorn, seeing how the woodland reacts, cutting some buckthorn, and doing these things, and watching how things change. And so these are some of the common plants that come back fairly quickly. Jack in the pulpit, not so much wild geranium. Solomon seal, false Solomon seal, black cherry, Virginia creeper, which is the same as woodbine, that vine. Those can form a ground father kind of quickly. And I have lots of plants to give away on my property. Every single workshop, and usually I'll get one, maybe 2 people that come over, but every spring and every fall, people can come to my property and get plants. These ones that are very common, I have wild ginger, Virginia waterleaf, woodbine, these types of things. So don't be shy. So here we have an area on the side of the parking lot at Big Willow Park, right on Minnetonka Boulevard, where they built the parking lot, of course. And they pushed the fill off to the side, made a steep slope. So we know we're not going to have wildflowers coming back in there. So we just used some storm-damaged limbs that came down from some box elders, and we just put the logs on the slope, and we put some stakes in front of them, and then we planted native plants in this little hillside. It's just half the hillside. We did it one year, me and one seasonal, and half the hillside has got wildflowers, and the other half is kind of weedy. And so you could go to big, and so we put mulch from the brush drop there, and that whole half of the hillside. Yeah, it works. So if you don't have the original topsoil from your property, you'll have to be doing your own planting. Okay. These are the things that I have on my property. It was turf and dandelions when I moved in. And of course I went to forestry school, so I just had to plant and plant and plant and plant. And these are things that are aggressive and will take over quickly. You wouldn't want to put them in your formal garden because they will spread pretty quickly. But if you have a woodland and you want to replace some things, wild ginger, if you've got ants, there's a flower at the base of the plant. It's a red flower, and the ants spread the seeds around. And I've got them all over the place. And now wild columbine does have an insect, so it's not as aggressive. If it didn't have an insect that eats it, that it evolved with on this continent, it would be an invasive species. Does that make sense? Because it germinates without stratification right away. Here we have Virginia waterleaf down here. Very, 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 seeds super easy. Here we have woodbine, Virginia creeper, the vine that I showed you. Here we have ostrich fern that spreads to form colonies, so you don't want it in your formal garden, but you could surely have it in a place that's a little bit more moist. So all of these, super easy to propagate by seed or by plants from other people. All right, so we're going to skip over that because it's just how to propagate each one of those species. Now we're getting into the native plants. You cut the buckthorn out, your native plants are there, and guess what? The rabbits and the rodents and the deer are going to have a party because now they don't have to fight their way through the buckthorn. And so here we have, and this is what it looks like. You can go out to any of our parks and you'll find wherever we've got rabbits and not enough owls and hawks, the gray dogwood just gets hammered. Here's American hazel, here's chokecherry, here's arrowwood viburnum. So as the snow is high, they're eating up high. As the snow is dropping, they're eating down low. And this is how a nice good-sized shrub that's 5-6 feet tall gets girdled, and then all of a sudden it's got to take its stored energy from its root system and sprout brand new. Now it's succulent, brand new tissue in the spring. Deer love brand new succulent tissue. So that's how the buckthorn is increasing and the native plants are decreasing. Does that make sense? And then we've got some huge patches of gray dogwood in Lone Lake Park where we've got the really nice big, some nice big ones. Everything that's smaller than about 1.25 inches diameter it gets girdled, and you can go in and see where it got girdled and it's dead from last year, and then it sprouted back up. And then, and then if there are owls, thank goodness, in Lone Lake Park, and so the populations fluctuate back and forth. But if you take some trail walks in Lone Lake Park, you'll see some tremendous damage. So if it's on your own property, and I take this personally, I have to put cages. So in my yard, if it's small and it's seedling size, I use this called hardware cloth. It's 1/2-inch square hardware cloth. And then as the deer, so the rodents eat from the bottom and the deer eat from the top. So the deer will come in and eat down there, and we've got no shortage of deer, that's for sure. The deer will also rub their antlers. So you see here on the left, oh my gosh, 1 to 2-inch diameters is exactly what they want. They're rubbing the velvet off of their antlers, and they will just, if this was a tree that you planted in your yard, it's probably worth $200. And once that bark is rubbed off, that is where the tree is transporting the water up and the nutrients down. And if you just lost half of that transport, that's not good. But what's even worse is this is exposed wood, which is susceptible to decay. So analogous to our skin, the bark is keeping the diseases and the decay organisms out. And the spores from decay fungi are all over in the air. We're breathing them all the time. And they land on that bare exposed wood, and if it has enough moisture, then it starts to decay in there, and they can just crack right off. And we here at Civic Center, as you drive in, there was a big planting in 2006 on the other side under the giant power lines, and they put in loads of aspen. And the deer came in and rubbed and wiped out 2/3 of them within the first 5 years. They were gone. And but they were sprouting from their root system, and so if we could get a cage around them, we saved some of them. But it's amazing the amount of effort you have to put in to protecting your native plants after. So spiral tubes work really nicely, but you have to watch them. You have to loosen them every year, because as the diameter is expanding, they can strangle, but you can loosen them on a regular basis. All right, here we go. What's next? Okay, so this is my front garage door. I use all of these materials depending on how big the plant is. Here is a grow tube you can use in full sun. If you've got a seedling, you put that in there, grow straight up and out. If you've got deer, once it comes out the top, then the deer will eat the leaves and kill the plant. So sometimes I now basically have to have a welded wire cage and a spiral tube inside. So the spiral tube is for the rodents, and the cage is for the deer. Now if you're so yeah, and green coated makes it a little less visible, but really it's very hard to see. So here's my next pictures to show you how hard it is to see. I had a client, I had a little business before I started Minnetonka, and he was worried about the fence being too visible. I had to get on exactly right on the side to get this left picture to even have the fence show up right here. Can you see that? So that was a big fence just to kind of deter them off his property. Okay, then there's brush piles. Deer are kind of lazy. They got it really good in the suburbs. They'll just walk around the brush pile. We do have an ordinance against brush piles, but that's a good place for seedlings to grow up, and protect some wildflowers. As you're in the transition of getting your buckthorn out, probably should get rid of this slide. Here's reuse of wood waste utilization. So I already talked about, using it on the slope. It's a little bit extra labor, making things into windrows. Buckthorn wood is very dense and hard. You can bring in a chipper. You can rent a chipper and chip it right back onto your property and use it for mulch. The only thing I would not do is put the berries through the chipper. And the berries are always within the last 2 feet of growth. So if you were to lay it down on your driveway, I do this all the time. I lay stuff down on my driveway, and I just get my lopper, and I'm lopping off the stuff that I don't want. And then the rest will go to the chipper or something else and can be reused. But there's a whole host of things you can redo. So you do the erosion control on your slope, woodworking, that comes next. Walking sticks are nice. You can make little fences and trellises. Firewood, I've heard that it's not fabulous, it's dense. You can burn the fruit if you want to in your fire pit. Minnetonka brush drop, we have our brush drop. Everybody aware of our brush drop? Okay. Alrighty, next slide. So I had to have a Buckthorn woodworking workshop. We only did it 1 year and invited people to come and bring in the things they make out of buckthorn. And here's the gentleman who was doing the volunteer work, and he just made, just cut it right out of the wood and made crude arbors. How about that? But then there's some man who I didn't even find. He says, oh, can I bring my stuff? And he used a lathe, and he turned them on a lathe, which is pretty cool. And somebody who made all kinds of things. It's kind of cool. Anyway, we only did that once. So this is the review. You've already heard this over and over and over again. If you wanted to take a picture of this one, this would be a good one to take. Top priorities for every buckthorn removal job and invasive species removal job. Somehow identify the natives. Use ribbon flagging or spray paint, something that's going to last for a few years as the buckthorn is growing up and down. I mean, you're going to miss some stumps and it's going to come back. There's other stuff that's going to come up from seedlings, and all of a sudden 3 years has gone by and, how did I not get back there? And all of a sudden the buckthorn is chest high. Remove or at least girdle the females first. Go through your property. It's nice in the springtime when you got a perfect spring day, to identify what's coming up in the fall when it's fall color. So the springtime is for the garlic mustard, to be monitoring for garlic mustard. But in the fall, when there's fall color, you walk through your property and look for anything that's turning fall color, and you're looking for berries. The berries on the female will turn from green to black in August. They'll look like little green peas in the summertime, and then they'll turn black. And anytime from that time on, you can start marking them that those would be the high priority removals. Remove the buckthorn around the natives that you found. So you're releasing them. That's a forestry term. Release it from competition. So if you've got a buckthorn, I must have taken that slide out. You can find cherries in the woods. There's a disease that grows on cherries called cherry black knot. It looks like black scat on a stick. You've probably all seen it if you hike in the woods. You seen it? Black scat on, it's cherry black knot. It does not have to be fatal. It can be pruned out. You can take it and prune it. In the wintertime, it shows up really good against the snow that's on the ground. You just prune a good 6 inches beyond it, at a branch, and then you make sure that goes in the garbage or the fire pit. But when you find the cherry black knot, of course you've got a cherry, that's number one. But if you have choke cherry, I can't believe I took that slide out. If you've got choke cherry sprouts from its root system. So you can look in that whole woods area, a good 15-foot diameter, and look for chokecherry buds. Now you got to know what chokecherry buds look like. That's one thing you can learn from coming to volunteer or going to Minnesota Wildflowers. But if you know what the buds look like, you can put little ribbon flags around all of them in that 15-foot area where they're popping up, and then take out all the buckthorn in that one spot. And now you've got a chokecherry thicket, and you didn't do anything except for remove those exact species. Okay, that's important. So you're releasing the native species from competition and cutting a space around them. And then you have to protect the native species with the items that I just showed you. Whatever you have that works, the tree guards, the wire cages, the fencing. So the best practices are, that's another one. Don't remove all the buckthorn if garlic mustard is present. Do it slower. You've heard me say that several times today. Work on both species gradually throughout the year. Protect the native wildflowers and sedges. I like to use white wire flags to mark where the wildflowers are, and then each year I will pull the garlic mustard around the wildflowers first to make sure that they're free. But then the deer might come in and eat them. That's a bummer. Don't cut all the vines. Learn the difference between grapevines and woodbine, because some can form a ground cover. Reuse the wood on site. We just went to cover that very thoroughly. Tap into grant money and local green. The 9 Mile Creek Watershed District has money for people who want to, if you live next to a creek or a pond or a lake, many times grant money will be available for you to remove buckthorn and plant native plants. How about that? So that's something you can tap into, hopefully. Do something every year, no matter how small. I mean, if you're just dying, so I plan this in late winter. We're getting nice weather. you just want to get out and do something, go find a female buckthorn on your property. And that's the first one to take care of, right? And you can be treating the stumps all the way up to mid-April. Now when you have a really late spring, buckthorn buds break open later. So when we've got the sap running in box elder and maple and black walnut and birch trees, those sap is running, and you'll get a wet saw on each one of them. But buckthorn is really slow, and it won't break bud and start to grow until late April. And if you watch that carefully, and as you're treating the bottom of your stump and you don't see any moisture coming up, you can treat. But once it starts getting to be a moist stump, you can't. So April 15th is my cutoff date. But from right now all the way through April 15th, you can be cutting and stump treating. How about that? How about that? And if you can't stump treat, you can wait until fall, leave your stump tall. How about that? So what else? So 4 keys to success: to prioritize your work, which we've covered thoroughly. Use ecologically sound methods so that you're not going to cause erosion or ruts or uprooting of native plants. Have a positive attitude because you're going to be at it for a while. It is a long-term commitment. There's a lot of seeds in the seed bank. And so if you do that, you might be surprised to have some fun things that pop up when you take your buckthorn out. So you see the little buckthorn seedlings around here? There's some good things in the woods. And of course, I have to give a plug for volunteer opportunities. You can work with us and do some of these methods and learn some native plants, but I know that you're busy. So that's my phone number on there. And my phone number is also on the website. And what else? Now I'm ready for questions. Any questions that you might have? I have extra handouts. So I have a really nice list of replacement plants for buckthorn in the understory. They're all native. I have, you might want this. This is the organization that sells the buckthorn blaster daubers. The gal who invented them sold it. So now they're a little bit more expensive. Still not bad, $9. And if you buy a duo kit, you get replacement tips and caps and all that. But here are some handouts for the dauber. And I have some of the Minnesota Wildflowers cards for the website right here. And what else? Any questions? I always have lots of questions. This would be the first time in 18 years I've not had questions after Buckthorn Workshop. Pardon me? Yeah. Oh, thank you for coming. I'm so glad you came. So glad you came. It's going to save you some work, right? Maybe save you some money if a contractor wants to come in and cut down your cherry trees. I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. Thank you very much.